Okay, so I have been digging a little bit deeper in WebSockets and specifically Polymarket WebSockets. In this video, I'm going to show you results from a test that I've done where I've measured one Polymarket connection, 2, 5, and 10 Polymarket connections, and then what improvement that actually has on the data quality, data gaps, latency, and so on. So if you are running a Polymarket trading bot with 1 or 2 WebSocket connections, you might want to listen to this video here because some evidence does point in the direction that you need at least 5 or 10 WebSocket connections to improve your data quality. And I'm going to show you that exactly in this video. So I've been running a test on the 5-minute Bitcoin up and down markets. This test has collected almost 9 million events across a total of 18 WebSocket connections, okay? 18 unique WebSocket connections. It has done 51 market rotations. So I'm just going to jump right into it and show you the data. So it's starting from the bottom here. You can see the coverage. The coverage is the events, how many events it actually misses. So if you have one connection, it missed about 20,000 events. So that's about 2,206 parts per million of events that it lost. It's still a 99.77% coverage, which is still pretty decent. But if we increase that to 2 parallel connections, it's almost no difference. But the main difference actually happens when we have 5 parallel connections. So we actually increased it or decreased the miss rate from about 2,200 to 565 parts per million. And then if you increase that to another 5, from 5 to 10, we actually reduce it even further. So more connection actually does increase the coverage, and you will actually get more data coverage by increasing it. So that's about the coverage of the data. We also have latency. So this one here measures the freshness. So when Polymarket sends an event from the WebSocket, the event has a timestamp. And then comparing that timestamp locally, you can measure the freshness or the latency of that. Now, I've been running these tests at home, which is pretty far away from Polymarket servers in London. So obviously these numbers here will be different if you run the same test. So the main takeaway here is not the absolute values of the latency, but rather the difference it makes going from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 parallel WebSocket connections. So you can see the median latency doing one WebSocket is 67.2 milliseconds. Increasing that to 2 parallel connection, we actually dropped it to 63. Going from 2 to 5, we dropped it to 58 milliseconds and then to 55.9 milliseconds. So going from one WebSocket, we had a median latency of 67 milliseconds. We dropped that actually more than 10 milliseconds, which is actually substantial. But how can you reduce the latency increase in the WebSockets? Well, the way you can do it is you have 10 WebSocket connections, all are sending events through like a pinhole. And then we're only going to take the most recent events. We're only going to take the first event to our trading bot. So if you filter all the fastest events from the WebSocket, because all the events, they're going to arrive to you in different times. You would assume it would arrive at the same time, but actually it doesn't. So if you have 10 connections and only pick the connection that's fastest, you can actually reduce your latency by filtering them. So that's actually what we did here. So this is the median. And if we look at the 95 percentile, so here only 5% would be slower than 522 milliseconds. And this is actually where we have the biggest decrease in latency. It's like the slowest connections is actually getting much faster. It's still not at par with the median, but it's still a significant change, more than the median actually. So if with just one connection, the 95 percentile here is 522 milliseconds. Again, from my own personal network, with you it's going to be different, obviously. Increasing that to 2 connection, we actually drop it probably around 40% to 305 milliseconds. Going from 2 to 5, we drop it even further to 175 and then to 154. Okay, so it's quite substantial. And then we also measure the largest gaps. So the largest gaps here is the data gap from an event to an event. So you can see here, having just one connection, we actually had a gap of almost 12 seconds at one point. And that was reduced to 4.86 because this is what happens all the time with these WebSockets. The connection drops, or there's a period where there's no data coming at all. So it's a substantial change, just increase in the connection from 1 to 2, but we're still talking about seconds. These 5 seconds here could mean the difference, right? But increasing that from 2 to 5, now we're talking milliseconds. And then the largest gap, having 10 connections, was only 2.88 milliseconds. There was only 141 events gap at one point when we had 10 connections. So this is substantial. Okay, you could argue, well, what's the benefit going from 5 to 10? There's probably a sweet spot around here. Another thing that I was measuring is, because I heard about people talking about warming up their connections. So what I did here, I measured if you warm up the connection first. So I added a 10-second warm-up window before I started to sort of using the data. And if you go and look here now, this one is reverse. We have 1 connection, 2 connection, 5 connection, and then below here is 10 connections. So this is again the latency or the freshness. So you can see here, it kind of fluctuates here a little bit. Okay, so 1 connection here, it actually increased it for some reason in my test here. Now in the other test I did, this one, it kind of fluctuates. So I think we would get more reliable data if we ran this test for say 24 hours. I might do this. If this video gets some traction, I might do this test over, let's say 24 hours or 2 days. But if you want to see this, where I run this test over, let's say 1 day or 2 days, even more, then drop a like or a comment down below. I can see the video gets some traction, then I'm gonna actually start that test. Going from 1 connection to 2 connection, you can see here, so this column here is basically the latency or the freshness, the first 10 seconds, and then the remaining is after the warm-up, after this 10-second warm-up period. And you can see here for 2 connections, it did decrease the latency or the freshness. Now 5 connections, it increased it, and then 10 connections, it decreases. So it's hard to draw conclusions about this. The past test that it did actually significantly improve the latencies of the connections if we did the warm-up. And here we are looking at the freshness by percentiles, so time from venue stamp to our arrival. Lower is better. So over 4 hours and 9 million events, the ranking is clear. The P50 tightens from 67 milliseconds to 56 milliseconds, and the 95 percentile collapses from 522 milliseconds to 154 milliseconds as connections grow from 1 to 10. There are 99 percentile tail off scale, 318 milliseconds to 3.8 seconds. Compresses even more dramatically. That's where redundancy earns its keep. So yeah, it's at these tail ends where there really is a big difference. You can see here how the 95 percentiles drops a lot the more connections you have. And then another one here is the first scene win rate. So basically what this graph here shows is, depending on how many connections that you have, which of these connections sees the event first. So this kind of ties in with also the latency, and it also measures the fair share of these connections and then how much it pulls above the fair share. So you have, for example, 1 connection here. The fair share of first seen, like the events that all the events we had, we have some kind of a fair share that one connection should have seen, which is 5.6. In our test, it actually only got 0.49%. It was only about 0.5% of the time where one connection, this topology here, was the one that saw an event first. Now, with two connections, the fair share would assume 11.1%, but it was actually only 3.81% of the time where these two connections would have seen the event first time. Now, if you increase that to 5 connections, now we're actually starting to see that it actually gets about a little bit above the fair share. So it got 28.13% of the time these 5 connections actually saw an event first time. And then here at the end, if we have 10 connections, the fair share would be 55%, but actually 76.57% of the time, this topology of 10 connections would actually see the event as the first time, so the first scene. So it clearly shows that more connections is better. Okay, so if you are worried about latency, it does make sense to increase the amount of connections. So as a sort of a wrap up of this video here, you can see here going from 1 to 2 connections, you're not really improving the miss rate of the events. You do decrease the freshness or the latency by about 4 milliseconds, at least in my test here. You drastically decrease the latency of the 95 percentile. You also increase the first scene, as we just discussed, like 8x, but from like 0.5% to almost 4%. Now, if you go from 2 to 5 connections, this is where the miss rate drastically decreases. So you decrease it from about 2,000 parts per million to about 600 parts per million. So that's like 74% decrease. Okay. We also decreased the latency by another 5 milliseconds. Okay, so from 63 to 85 to 58 milliseconds. And again, the freshness from the 95 percentile or the latency, we decreased that 130 milliseconds. And then the first scene is another like 7x. We go from about 4% to 28%. Now, if we go from 5 to 10 connections, we decrease the miss rate another like 40%. We also decrease the latency with 2 milliseconds. We decrease the latency of the 95 percentile with 21 milliseconds. And then again, we increase the first scene by 2x. So it's quite dramatically. So I would say like the sweet spot is probably somewhere between 5 to 10 connections. But what you have to keep in mind is it's a lot of data, okay? Because you have to handle that in your system. And you can see here that having all these, so this was 18 connections. So 18 connections collected about 9 million events over 4 hours, okay? If you go back down here, you can see here that this is all the different markets. So we start the markets here, and then we have here's a hotspot of a connection stalling. And here we stall again, stall, and then we actually have a gap here in of 11 seconds. So we saw the 11-second gap here with a single connection. So this is, I think this is where several connections kind of shine, is when you have a trading bot running for a long time. You will have these gaps in your connections, and having a backup connection actually can address this. Currently in Ravn, I have the way I think based on this research I've done here, I'm gonna do some tweaks to Ravn. I have to figure this out because currently every trading bot will have its own connections, and I think I've seen people talk about getting rate limited. So if I have 10 connections per bot, it's probably going to get rate limited. So I'm going to think about how to improve this in Ravn. The way it currently is each trading bot actually gets 3 connections. So it gets 2 concurrent connections and then a backup connection. And then it's going to rotate it continually. So that's how it currently is in Ravn. based on this, I have to figure out how I can increase this to at least 5, ideally 10. So yeah, when I figure that out, I'm gonna report back either here on YouTube or on Discord or in the changelog of Ravn. Yeah, so if you have any ideas about other interesting things that I could test with these web sockets, or maybe other things that you had in mind, you can leave a comment down below. And if you want me to run this test over 2 days or 3 days, also like this video, leave a comment down below so I see that there's actually an interest for this, and then I'm gonna go ahead and make that test. So with that said, see you at the next video and have a good one. Bye bye.